Hi, all. Welcome back to Environmental Science. Today we're going to kind of finish up talking about population ecology with a topic that is kind of multifaceted, meaning that there's lots of little components to it, and that is how do ecosystems change? How do populations change over time? How do communities change? And how do they reintroduce stability? How do they come about after large-scale changes? Okay, so the first piece I want to talk about is MacArthur's work. Okay, it's unfortunate that we didn't get more from MacArthur. He died in his 40s of cancer, but he was really prolific publisher and researcher on what we call resource distribution. And so he was interested in something that we call resource partitioning, or the ability for organisms to decrease competition by altering maybe where they feed in an ecosystem. We kind of talked about this a little bit before, but MacArthur's work was done mainly on warblers, and so he would look at warbler species and where they were found within like a species of tree. And he noticed that warblers, all being different species here, they're majority of them feeding on insects, and he found though that they would occupy different niches and stick to those niches and kind of partition out the entire tree. So say yellow rump warbler would be at the trunk of the tree feeding on insects in this region. The Cape May warbler would be at the crown of the tree feeding here, and other warblers in between. And they did so basically to decrease competition. Okay? Some studies have supported the idea of resource partitioning. We see it also in kind of marine environments and aquatic environments where you might see things that are more developed for like a longer neck to feed in deeper water, long legs, things like that. Flamingos will partition themselves out into deeper waters. Ducks, like the mallard here, which is called the dabbling duck, and they tend to kind of dunk their head and feed. They're a little bit shallower than flamingos, but they can also be in deep water. But they partition themselves out. The avocets are closer to the shore. The oyster catchers are like right on the border of water and land, and then the plovers are out in the land or on the beach, and they partition themselves out in that way, and that really allows them to avoid competition. Competition is expensive. If you're next to a different species and you're competing for the same resource, not only are you getting less of that resource, but you're also typically positioning yourself behaviorally. Maybe you're chasing the other species constantly, or maybe they're chasing you. Maybe they're larger than you, so they attack you. The competition, in a sense, is expensive. It's energy that is wasted from an ecological perspective. Okay? So MacArthur's work was really to see, well, how do species get around competition? And what happens when deforestation happens and you have less trees and you get more species that have to partition? Are some better at outcompeting others? Do you lose species altogether due to the competition? What's going on? And others have taken this research to not forested habitat, but marine or transitional habitats between terrestrial and aquatic habitats to look at the same kind of thing. And one question that comes to mind from me is, what about keystone species? Where do they fit in this resource partitioning? Are these ecosystems a result of there is no keystone species? So if you remove the flamingo, do the ducks just move to where the flamingo were and take up their resources? And now the ducks have a bigger portion of the resource, bigger portion of the niche. The oyster catcher, if you remove it, is that what's holding this plover to its realized niche, and the plover actually could move in closer to the water for its fundamental niche? Or are some of these species keystone species, and if you remove them, the ecosystem really collapses and doesn't do well? That's why ecologists do what they do. That's why they study these relationships between the organism and its environment to know, what if we disturb the environment enough that one of the species is removed, or that the habitat that that species occupies is now gone, or reduced? What happens to the stability of that ecosystem? Okay? Along the same lines, a little bit different, are what we call edges and boundaries. And this is kind of interesting ecological work that's often done in, I guess, in response to human disturbances. So humans are very good at creating boundaries and edges. Okay? And so we have what we call an edge effect. And that is the area that's joining two different habitats. Maybe one habitat is suitable for an organism and the other habitat is not, or maybe both are suitable for the organism and they utilize them in different ways. So for example, let's take something like a mule deer or white-tailed deer. They may hide in forest habitat, but right along the border of where forest is and open grassland, maybe that's where they like to reside, on that boundary, that edge, because then they can move out into the grassland, they can feed, they have, they can see a long ways, so they can see for predators. But maybe when it's time to, lay down, get some rest, whatever, they move back into structure where they're protected from aerial predators, and they can hide in a forested habitat. That's that edge effect, that boundary between one habitat and another habitat. And lots of organisms use it. Humans are very good at manipulating this and causing more boundary effects, which also can increase some species. So some species of predators are really adapted to that edge effect. And the more edge effect you have with less core area, often you have a greater problem in that ecosystem. Here's what I mean by that. So you might have the same total area. So let's say we come through and we make housing complexes that take up all this area, but we're like, hey, we're leaving this forest habitat that's around this urban environment. We're leaving forests in between. But the problem is none of the forests are deep enough to have what we call a core area. So even though you might have the same amount of total area as you do if you just built your complexes on each side of this core area, there is no core area. So it's all edge effect. Okay? And so predators, they can just roam the edge, and prey are susceptible to this area more so than they would be to this area. They can get into this core area, they can hide, they can nest, they can in some cases feed, and they're not susceptible to the edge effect as much. And so this is where ecologists often come in, and they'll look at, well, yes, we need connected areas. So when we're planning for urban sprawl and things like that, we need connected areas, but do those connected areas have core areas? Do they provide a region in which species can get away from the predation? And one of the best ways that we do this, one of the most severe ways that we create this problem, is by roads. We generate roads all over the landscape. And those roads provide really good avenues for predators to just walk the roads. And so if you've ever walked dirt, gravel roads, often if you're walking them, you'll see predator tracks that are walking just along the roads. And if you've drove a lot of dirt roads, you'll see that's where a lot of the predators stay. Is it's easy for predators to cover lots of ground and hunt along roadways, and lots of predators will do that. Okay? Another thing is ecotones, and this is often also on the mind of ecologists or environmental scientists when we're talking about trying to maintain some type of ecosystem, but allow for urbanization to occur, allow for population to increase, but still try to maintain some wild places. And that really comes into play when we talk about ecotones, or the boundaries between adjacent communities. So either you can have sharp boundaries where, it's basically you clear cut the trees and then, that's it. There's no transition. There's no soft boundary or indistinct boundary where you might have you might have heavy forest moving into lighter forest, moving into fewer trees, moving into grasslands, then moving into urban environment. Instead, we might have sharp boundaries where we just cut it right off at heavy trees, and behind, this housing complex is just a forest. And that's a sharp boundary, and there are different communities, different organisms that can occupy sharp boundaries, and different organisms that need that indistinct boundary where you have a transition period, and because they have different capabilities, their life cycle might evolve different regions, and it's not just forest or no forest kind of thing. Same situation in marine habitats. We have very similar things where we're talking about these strict kind of sharp boundaries between coral reefs, open ocean. And especially when we're talking about marine protected areas, or regions where we allow fishing and not allow fishing, or allow consumption or take and non-take, okay, there can be these really sharp boundaries where right at the edge of the coral reef, that's open to fishing, that's open to dredging, taking material, okay, and then you have this sharp boundary of this coral reef that's not open, okay. And so certain species do fine, other species, they need that indistinct boundary, they need that open kind of community to survive. All right. So let's look at, what happens if huge disturbances happen, and how do ecosystems recover from that? Okay? So we call this ecological succession. And ecological succession is when something occurs, and then how does the environment, how does the community come back from that disturbance? Excuse me. So we have what we call primary succession. Okay, and these are organisms that would come in and take over an ecosystem that's been heavily disturbed. Okay, so you have extreme wildfire that comes through, super hot, burns up, sterilizes the ground, and you might have primary succession. Lava flows are probably the best example of this, because they lay down new land and it's starting over. But another example of this is when we take and we urbanize an environment, and we just lay down concrete, asphalt, cement, etc. But then over time, a long period of time, maybe we abandon that area. Right? Maybe we stop using that area and we've moved on. And how does the ecosystem respond to that? And that's really where pioneer species come in. So a pioneer species is a species that can be the first colonist, that can occupy new land, and they can make that land suitable for the next group of species. Secondary succession is normally kind of a less of a disturbance. Okay? So these are typical disturbances that might happen often. So you might get the plowing of fields, you might get a little bit of fire, but it's not to the degree that you're going to start all over, new land or completely new habitat. Okay? And it depends on the severity of it. Most human-induced change is resulting in secondary succession, like a clear cut, or the plowing of the land, or removing coral reefs or something like that. Is typically secondary succession, disturbance from that. It's not completely back to level zero or ground zero, but you've removed a lot of what we call the climax community. So climax community is the last community, the community that often is stable and is really what we would describe that ecosystem as. So for example, let's look at say a forest habitat. Let's say Mount Rainier, or better yet Mount St. Helens, erupted. It exposes rocks. Okay, so it takes off all living organisms. Gone. We're down to just rock. Okay, the first pioneer species that might come into that region, lichen and moss. Okay, they're going to break down those rocks. They're going to start taking that rock and those minerals, and they start mixing organic material, their dead material, with these minerals, and eventually, over time, the minerals and the organic material builds up enough that you can get things like grass, herbs, shrubs, seedlings come in. Okay, and then over a little more time, you get a diverse group of species. Okay, that maybe includes aspen and pines and things like that. And then a little bit more time, okay, some of that community is replaced by older, better suited organisms that outcompete these organisms. And that's kind of how you transition from a pioneer community to a climax community. We can do this in ocean environments, and we do so often. Okay? So if there's a huge disturbance, like a volcano erupts and lava pours into the ocean and creates new rock, okay, the first species typically becomes things that can inhabit those exposed rocks, like sponges, which are going to be filter feeders. So they'll get established on the new rocks, and they'll start filter feeding, and then when they die, they start creating a little bit of organic material around the rocks, and then you can get things like photosynthesizing plants and algae and things like that can get established and get nutrients from it. And then once they get established, you get other organisms that might come in that can feed on the primary producers. And so you still have that same tradition in marine habitats as you do terrestrial habitats, and you're moving from basically no organic material to a climax community that's stable. And that's the community transition. That's how succession works. So we can look at this kind of from a marine perspective a little bit. And so if we're talking about regions like coral reefs, like in Florida, this is a good example of a coral reef in Florida. In 1971, this is what the coral reef looked like, and you can see there's a lot of elkhorn corals and things like that occur in this region. Fairly diverse, lots of long, expansive coral, and then by the time we look in '88, those coral are gone, and you might still have some coral in the region, but most of those large, expansive corals, they've been removed, crushed, okay, due to either boating activities, swimming activities, fishing activities, but the human disturbance has removed them from the ecosystem. There's a few left, little tiny ones around, but this is the same region, same place. And you get a few organisms that are established that can withstand a little bit of the disturbance. Okay, then if we set aside and realize that our disturbance is, are occurring, this is basically starting at ground zero or close. This is secondary succession because you still have life and things like that. But starting, with a huge disturbance, you get these pioneer species coming back. So 10 years later, you start to see a lot of sponges, some soft corals that come in. And then, a little bit later, 5 years later, 6 years later, you get kind of the sponge community is getting larger, and you start getting some diversity of corals back. So it happens over time, but the problem with corals in general is, so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about Xanthrian coral. They're a polyp, they're a living organism, living animal. Okay, they're not plants. They have photosynthetic properties, so they have xanthal algae that are embedded within their cells, so they can do photosynthesis. They also consume things, so they get nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, from eating things, and then they can pass that to algae that occur in these specialized cells. But the reason why corals and coral reefs are so susceptible to human disturbances is because these little polyps, these little cnidarians, jellyfish, upside down jellyfish, basically, what they're doing is they're excreting calcium carbonate. Okay, so they excrete this calcium carbonate skeleton that the polyp lives in. And that's what the coral reef is. And it's just thousands upon millions of these little polyps, tiny little microscopic organisms that are excreting calcium carbonate skeleton. And so breaking one of these can take hundreds of years for that organism to rebuild what one flipper from a swimmer can do, damage can do to an ecosystem, depending on, obviously, on the resources within that ecosystem. All right, so disturbances, again, we can look at disturbances, and how they affect species diversity, abundance, and again, this is what we're often doing when we're studying environmental science or population ecology. We look at disturbances, whether that be related to humans, like human-caused fires or logging, or related to just the natural ecosystem, hurricanes, tornadoes, those kind of things. Some which might be induced by humans, maybe not. That verdict is still out there. But the disturbances that occur, often, it depends on the disturbance, of course, but often they are going to alter the ecosystem in a way that can change the ecosystem to increase maybe competitive species, or increase competition within species. Because if you remove resources, like if a fire comes through and burns through an ecosystem, and now you have less trees, then you have less resources. And if you have less resources, you increase competition. So what happens is the species that are less competitive, the species that aren't, maybe not the best suited for that environment, they lose out. And so you can have real ecosystem effects. You can really have changes that occur in the entire ecosystem. But the individuals that are disturbance-adapted species that are adapted and can maybe change their diet quickly, or maybe they can withstand lower rainfall, or maybe they can withstand poor habitats, poor pH, that kind of thing. They tend to survive. Those are the individuals that tend to make it, and maybe they'll be replaced later on as the ecosystem reaches the climax stage. But those disturbance-adapted species, or the pioneer species, will often survive. And sometimes you can see an ecosystem that has pioneer species and non-pioneer species in the same ecosystem. There might be a little competition between them. A disturbance happens, and now that pioneer species is much more like population explosion, and they do much better. Okay, so there are examples of this from different insect communities. So you might have this competition between two species of harvester ants, where if you're in an unburnt ecosystem, maybe the populations just hang out and they're relatively keeping each individual into check, and then you might burn that ecosystem, and when it's burnt, then you might see this explosion of one species because they're a pioneer species. They can handle the bird habitat more so than the other. Okay? You can also have other species where similar things, like their population might be doing just fine, and then you get a ecosystem which they're not suited for that habitat at all, and so you might get this crash of both species in ecosystems. So it really depends on the organism and how they react to that, or how they are associated with whether the ecosystem's been burnt or not. So this is just showing this species, it tends to not do well in burnt habitats, and this species tends to do well. So if they're both in the same ecosystem, these harvester ants are going to outcompete them if it's burnt. In an ecosystem where it's not burnt, these guys are probably going to outcompete the harvester ants. And so that's fairly typical. But in some cases, like the ecosystem loses a lot of organisms when you have storms, fires, logging, etc. Okay. And this is just an example of how much disturbance we have had in certain regions over kind of a 40-year period or whatever, and you can start to see that the red, which means settlement ecosystems, or complete settlement ecosystems, means development. You can see that in most regions, even regions where it used to be a very prestige region, heavy forested, etc., it's been increasing over the last 40 years. The severity, the complexity of human structure. And so forested ecosystem here is green, okay, weak, meaning that weak disturbance. And as you can see, there's less and less weak disturbances, and you get more and more red on the map. And really, we can look at this across many, many regions. And when we do, it's all the same. Human modification of terrestrial habitats is increased everywhere. So 5 categories of impact, really: human settlement, agriculture, transportation, mining, energy, and electrical infrastructure. And you can see it's just everywhere. This is a map showing, the brighter the color, the more human disturbance there is, and there's a lot of ecosystems. There are some that are still somewhat have less eco disturbance, like the Amazon, like the Congo, okay, like Central Australia, but in many cases, the dark regions are getting smaller and smaller as the world's population keeps increasing. So we would say that there's about 5% of the world that's unaffected by human disturbance. And so together with low modification and unaffected, we're close to 50%. So 50% of the world has been highly modified or modified to a degree that it causes disturbance that ecosystems can feel. Now, does that mean all is lost? I don't think so, because look what happens when we abandon regions like Chernobyl. Okay, we abandoned this region because we did something, we created something, and it doesn't work. We don't use it anymore. It was a bad situation that happened, but look, pioneer species are coming in. Okay, they're taking over. They're getting between the cracks in the concrete, and they're establishing themselves. There's trees growing, and over time, the community will come back. It will remove all the man-made material. It takes a long period of time, but it will come back. And so there is hope for regions that may be highly disturbed, that over time nature would reclaim those regions. Okay?